the Athenians say, that's a great idea. Let's send a massive force against Sicily and Syracuse so the war can be won just like that, okay? Shock and awe. So the problem, though, is that never before in its history has Athens sent a large expedition force against another power. Okay, does that make sense? When the Persians invaded, they were invading Athens. Athens didn't go invade Persia. So when you have sent a massive expedition force against another country, what is your number one problem? What is the thing that you must resolve? But the Athenians didn't really think about it because they had absolutely no experience in fighting a foreign war. Okay, so the enemy knows the terrain better than you do, okay? But there's actually a much bigger problem than that. And it is what? Okay, the biggest problem is resupply. And this is something that the Athenians didn't think about because they never never fought a war like this before, okay? So they sent this huge expedition against Sicily. And Syracuse, which was a naval power, were surprised because they were like, why would the Athenians want to invade us? Okay? So for the first year, the Athenians were destroying the Syracuse army. And the Syracuse army had to retreat back into their city, okay? And so the Athenians laid siege to the city. Okay, the Athenians, Syracuse is here, the Athenians are here. And the Athenians control the sea, right? Okay? So this situation is very similar to this situation, okay? Do you understand? But then what happened was that the Athenians couldn't resupply themselves. And the reason why is Syracuse also had a navy, and they could stop the Athenian navy from resupplying the Athenian troops. And therefore, the Athenian army was wiped out in Sicily. And this caused the Athenians to ultimately lose the war against Sparta, and it caused the Athenian Empire to collapse. Okay? Do you understand? And again, historians have been trying to figure out for a long time why the Athenians would do such a stupid thing as to send a huge army against Syracuse. Because the risk of failure was catastrophic. Okay? And the only answer is, well, the Athenians had hubris, okay? They never really lost the war, and they had become addicted to empire, which is the same situation America finds itself in today. Okay? Does that make sense, guys? All right? So this has happened before in history, when the Athenians invaded Sicily and lost to Syracuse. Their entire army was wiped out in Syracuse, okay? Because they couldn't resupply their army. Does that make sense? Right. The second example we can look at is the Vietnam War. So in the beginning of 1960, okay, the beginning of the decade, most Americans have never heard of a country called Vietnam. Okay? Most Americans didn't know what it was, didn't know where it was, okay? By the end of the decade, in 1969, 500,000 American soldiers were in the country, destroying everything, okay? But also getting destroyed themselves. 58,000 US soldiers died in Vietnam. So the question then is, how did this happen? Why would this happen? 1960, Vietnam was a distant country no one's ever heard of. By the end of the decade, 500,000 US soldiers were in country fighting this war against an enemy they really didn't know. Okay? In 1971, the Pentagon Papers came out. And the Pentagon Papers was a history of America's involvement in the Vietnam War dating back to the 1950s, okay? And it made three major points. The first point is that American leadership, military leadership, has been expanding the war in Vietnam without public knowledge, okay? This is what we call mission creep. So maybe at first they sent some observers to the country, then they sent some advisors, then trainers, then soldiers, okay? So mission creep. Slowly over time, things escalate. And you don't really understand why things escalate, but they do, okay? Second point is that American leadership, from very early on, knew the war was unwinnable. This was the greatest military in the world. They dropped more bombs in Vietnam in the 60s than all bombs were dropped in World War II, okay? And they could not win the war. And the reason why is, to win a war, you have to solve 3 problems, okay? Okay? The first problem is clear strategy, okay? What are you trying to accomplish in this country? What are your clear military objectives, okay? Second is, you must adapt to the battlefield, okay? Because all your best plans will change over the course of a battle, okay? So the adversary that is most willing to adapt to the battlefield will win, okay? And the third thing is the will to fight. So if you want to look at a war and who's most likely to win the war, you ask these 3 questions. 1, does this guy have clear military objectives that everyone understands? Because that will determine strategy, okay? Second is this guy adapting to the battlefield? And the third is this guy, does this guy still have the will to fight? If the answer is yes to all 3 questions, then the person will most likely win the war. Okay, and if you look at the Vietnam War, even though America was killing a lot of people, it killed 3 million Vietnamese during the course of the war, it was not destroying the enemy's will to fight. In fact, it was making them angrier. And therefore, more people were willing to fight the Americans. Okay? So very early on, the American political leadership knew the war could not be won. So then the question then is, why did America stay in the war? And the answer is credibility. Okay? Credibility just means they didn't want to lose face. They didn't want to be laughed at by the Chinese and by the Soviets and by the Europeans, okay? But there's actually another way to understand credibility, and it's what we call the sunk cost fallacy. Okay? Have you guys heard of the sunk cost fallacy? Okay, and the idea is never ever go into a casino. The reason why is that when you go into a casino and you start losing money, at some point you cannot leave the casino. Why not?
You feel like you've lost so much, so now you have to make it back.
Exactly. You want to reclaim the money you've lost, okay? You've invested so much that you cannot leave. You have to get that money back. And that's the problem with war. Eventually, you've invested so much, you cannot leave the war. And that's what happened in Vietnam. America invested so much, it didn't want to leave the war because it did not want to admit that all this has been lost. Okay? It's what we call the sunk cost fallacy. And that's why, even though America could not win the war, it still wanted to fight the war. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so the Vietnam War is another example, okay, that is similar to this.